before, inflation and the unemployment, how those two things are related is going to give us the Phillips curve. As you look at the Phillips curve, what you're going to see is, well, first of all, you can go look at this video by Mr. Clifford, click on that. It'll go through kind of the same thing that I'm going to do, and so anytime you can look at a Mr. Clifford video, it's a great idea. Basically, what your short run Phillips curve is, it's going to be a downward sloping line that's going to show how unemployment and inflation go together. It'll show us that negative supply shocks cause this thing to go up. It'll show us how positive demand shocks will cause it to go down. And when you look at this right here, this sort of explains the concept. Probably the easiest thing to do, though, is to just graph it out. And if you graph it out, you're usually going to be in a good place. So let's see what that actually looks like. If I go to my whiteboard here and I look at aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So here is my aggregate supply, aggregate demand. This will be my Phillips curve. So as I'm looking at these two graphs right here, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, here's my graph, right? Here is my aggregate supply. Here is my aggregate demand. This is my price level. This is my real GDP. Okay. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand is hitting right here, which is going to give me a PL1. And it's also going to give me, let's say this is Y at full employment. All right. And that's going to give us a point here with, let's just say that is going to be point A. That point A is showing us how much inflation is happening versus how much people are employed. Over here on my, this is going to be my Phillips curve, I also have this point A, and that point is showing me here inflation, but it's also showing me here unemployment. All right, so I graph those two things out, and I can kind of see how that works, right? Well, what happens when we see aggregate demand, let's say aggregate demand shifted to the right. If I see aggregate demand shift to the right, as that occurs, I'm going to see a new point on my aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, right? This new point on my aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph is going to be up here. I'm going to see an increase in inflation, right? It's a PL2. And I'm also going to see more people have a job. So that's going to be, let's say, Y1 over here. Well, when that occurs and I see more inflation and less unemployment, okay, now I have to go here to say, all right, where would that point, let's call that one point B, right? Where is that point B going to be? Well, more inflation and less unemployment is actually going to be right here. And those 2 points are going to be on a line called my short run Phillips curve, right? So basically, if you just graph that out, you're always going to be able to see what happens, right? If I have higher inflation and I have less unemployment, right? So here you go. Higher inflation, less unemployment, higher inflation, less unemployment, then you're going to see those the line here is going to be like a negative relationship, and you're going to see this thing sloping downward as my Phillips curve. Okay, well now what do we know is going to happen in our adjustment process if, let's say I was in the long run before. So let's put a long run line down, and let's say my long run aggregate supply curve is right here. Right, so there's my long run aggregate supply curve. Now, my LRAS is showing me that right now I'm in an inflationary gap. We know what happens when I'm in an inflationary gap. People start to do things like, oh yeah, I am going to start trying to demand that raise to keep up with inflation. And you're like, oh, so now what am I going to do? I'm going to start seeing suppliers supply less. So I'm going to see a shift of that aggregate supply to the left, right? My short run aggregate supply will shift here, and I'll end up at a point up here. Let's call that point C. All right, so point C caused me to have more inflation, let's say PL3, but it also caused more unemployment. Well, when I look over here on my Phillips curve, the only way I can get higher inflation but then more unemployment would be to have a point somewhere over in here. So what happens in my short run Phillips curve is my short run Phillips curve has shifted over here. Short run Phillips curve 2. And when my short run Phillips curve 2 happens, this starts to develop a long run Phillips curve. So that long run Phillips curve showed me going from point A to point B in the temporary and then up to point C, which is mirroring what's happening here from point A to point B to point C in my aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So the Phillips curve is just representing what is occurring as we look at that aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, but if we're just relating it to inflation and unemployment. All right. So as you go back to this, these are your notes on this section telling you that exact concept. But I think if you just graph it, you're going to see how it works pretty easily. Now, as you're looking at this, there's some stuff in here that's nice to know, talking about what happens when people see inflation and then demand higher wages, etc. You're going to see exactly what we just graphed. Short run Phillips curve is going to shift up. As you look at inflation and unemployment in the long run, there's lots and lots of data points. Some people even say that the Phillips curve is sort of a, like, as our economy has moved on, it was more relevant in the 60s and 70s versus like maybe now. But it's still testable on your AP, so you still have to know it. You can also see this concept in your notes or in your PowerPoint slides as you're just moving from point E to A to E and then E to B to E. Everything is, as you get more of a short run Phillips curve happening, you're going to eventually see how that long run Phillips curve will be developed. All right. Your long run Phillips curve then is going to give you what is called your natural rate of unemployment, which is just going to be wherever that curve is happening in terms of our unemployment. It's right where our full employment is on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand. The natural rate of unemployment is just NAIRU, right? Non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And then it can work where we see like deflation happening or disinflation going on. If we start seeing that come down, our long run Phillips curve, there can be some real negatives that happen. Whenever we see lower price levels, obviously lenders gain, right? Borrowers lose. We learned that before. But one of the problems is this zero bound. Monetary policy becomes ineffective if you cannot lower your interest rate lower than zero. We're in a weird time right now because the Fed has already done that for us and there's nothing else the Fed can do. So you have to be careful about using monetary policy and watching some of these unemployment and inflation things happen, because if you get deflation to the point where, oh, I know, let's try to get more people to borrow. If people won't borrow money and spend it, even when inflation rates are zero, that's where we end up in this zero bound situation. And it has a name. It's called a liquidity trap. Even though you have as much money out there as possible, people still are not borrowing it because they're not confident in the economy. And the only way to fix that would be doing something like give negative interest rates, which would basically be you're paying people to borrow. That would be crazy. All right, that's the concept. Good luck. See you next time.